Good evening, everyone. We begin the readout tonight with one of the most high-stakes presidential trips in recent memory. President Joe Biden is embarking on an emergency mission to Europe, meeting with NATO leaders in Brussels and then heading to Poland, a country on the front lines of the humanitarian and military crisis in Ukraine.
The single most important thing that we can do from the outset is keep the democracies united in our opposition and our effort to curtail the devastation that is occurring at the hands of a man who, I quite frankly, think is a war criminal. And I think it will meet the legal definition of that as well.
It is perhaps the most important moment in Biden's presidency so far, a moment that will punctuate world history for decades to come. It's the engagement of an American president in the battle for democracy on the world stage, and not just any U.S. president. This is Joseph Robinette Biden, a man who came to the presidency with foreign policy chops and a family steeped in military service and loss. It's almost impossible to think about Joe Biden, the man, without thinking about his son, Beau, who died of brain cancer after serving in Iraq. Which is why you're going to see the usual photos that we see with presidents, lots of images of the commander-in-chief taking selfies with the troops. Plus lots of Joe Bidening, eating jalapeno and pepperoni pizza with American troops stationed in Poland near the border with Ukraine, and lots of conversations with service members about Beau. Foreign policy and empathy. It is this president's brand. And that very particular combination matters as we see the president assuming the leadership of a newly united West, as millions of refugees flee from Putin's bombs. Ukraine's neighbor, Poland, has taken in 2.1 million refugees. That number is larger than the population of Poland's capital, Warsaw. Tomorrow, President Biden will meet with Ukrainians displaced by the conflict, and then, in Warsaw, he will deliver what could be the most important speech of his career. We have seen these moments before. President John F. Kennedy, Biden's presidential idol and the only other Catholic president in U.S. history, in his 1963 anti-communist speech in West Berlin, a focal point of Cold War rivalry, offering American solidarity to the citizens of West Germany versus the then USSR. Once again, America must unite with the West to stop a tyrannical assault on freedom, as the bloodshed continues with missiles indiscriminately targeting Ukrainian civilians and supplies. Ukrainian forces continue to show resolve, keeping the Russians out of Kyiv. But the stakes couldn't be higher on this 30th day of fighting, as fears grow that a desperate Putin could unleash chemical weapons on Ukrainian civilians. Joining me now is former CIA Director John Brennan, who is an MSNBC senior national security and intelligence analyst, and former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, author of Lessons from the Edge, a memoir. And I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Yovanovitch. From your perspective, as somebody who was an ambassador to Ukraine and has lived just the sort of high and the low ends of what has happened between the United States and Ukraine, what would you say is the significance of the speech that President Biden will give tomorrow?
Well, I think it's hugely important for two different reasons. One is to focus on what is happening in Ukraine, to call out Russian actions for what they are, war crimes, as we just heard the president declare, demand a ceasefire, and warn Putin not to escalate. But I think on another level, and you touched on this in your introduction, it's also about explaining to the American people and the world that why Ukraine is important, that Ukraine is the canary in the coal mine in the fight of, in the battle between tyranny and liberty. And if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, he's going to keep on going. That's what he told us when he started this war. And it's what he's done in the past. He's kept on going with the invasion in Georgia in 2008 and the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And so I think it's going to be important for all of us to understand that this is a hinge moment in history. The Ukrainian people are meeting this challenge, and the rest of the world needs to as well.
And, you know, John Brennan, similar question to you about what the strategic importance of this speech is, given the following. I'm going to read a little bit from what the New York Times is reporting, that Russia is signaling, perhaps maybe they're crying uncle a little bit. They've signaled on Friday that it may be reducing its war aims, announcing that it would now focus its forces on taking more territory in eastern Ukraine, and that the goals of the first stage of the operation, quote, had been mainly accomplished, with Ukraine putting up fierce resistance and Russia having failed to seize key cities in the early days of the war. Friday's statement from a senior general amounted to the most direct acknowledgement yet that Russia would not be able to take control of all or most of Ukraine. What do you think the significance of that is, and the significance of this speech in terms of the strategic interests at hand?
Well, as you said, Joy, we are at a very critical inflection point, not only in terms of the U.S. Policies abroad, but also in terms of NATO's cohesion, as well as global peace and security. And therefore, I think it's so critically important that President Biden, who has this wealth of experience on the foreign policy front, is able to demonstrate America's commitment tangibly, not only by his presence along those frontline states, but also by the announcements about the extent of U.S. aid, humanitarian aid, $1 billion, plus the continued flow of weapons. And so therefore, I think it's critically important to demonstrate that we are in this. This is still very much of a hot war. And although maybe the Russians are sending out some signals that they're going to focus on Donbass, I think it really reflects the fact that the Russians realize that things are not going well at all for them, and that they really are taking it on the chin. But it's so important that by the president's presence out there, that he signals not only to our NATO partners and to the Ukrainians, but also to the Russians, that we are here to stay. We're going to stand by our Ukrainian partners, and we're in this until the very end, whatever that end might be.
And Ambassador Yovanovitch, let's talk a little bit about the sort of ironies. I mean, the United States has been the good guy and the bad guy on the world stage, depending on the era. I mean, during the Iraq War, much of the world was absolutely outraged by American leadership. Ditto when Donald Trump was president and all but threatened to pull us out of NATO, and probably would have pulled us out of NATO, got out of the climate change agreements, out of the Iran nuclear deal, just made America sort of a rogue version of ourselves. So now we see kind of the reverse of that. Joe Biden sort of bringing back the West and saying the West is back, America is back, and NATO certainly seems to be back. But some of the countries that are now actually doing the right thing when it comes to refugees have some challenges internally as well. We know that Hungary is led by Viktor Orban, who is an autocrat, but they're taking people in. You have Poland, the Associated Press talking about their president, President Duda. He's allied with a right-wing political party, this according to the Associated Press, who's accused of eroding democratic norms. The European Union has accused Poland of eroding judicial independence. Poland's government has also incurred international criticism for eroding media independence, for anti-LGBT rhetoric by Duda and others, and over the use of Pegasus spyware against government critics. There is not a sort of united West in terms of democratic values. And so I'm wondering, how does that impact our ability to lead when we're not leading like democracies?
Well, you're right to point out that this is a challenge, but I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can talk to our partners about some of the democratic challenges that they're facing. And, you know, perhaps they might want to talk to us about some of the challenges that we're facing here in the United States as well. But that doesn't detract from the fact that we can be security partners as well. And I think that's what you're seeing right now on the ground in Brussels and in Poland. American leadership and, frankly, American values, democratic values, small d democratic values, when we choose to support Ukraine in this really important war of, frankly, liberty versus tyranny.
You know, and John Brennan, you and I, we've talked about this a lot on the show. You know, the fact that we're struggling, as, you know, Ambassador Yovanovitch indicated, with our own democracy being in peril. And, you know, Joe Biden is not leading a country whose democracy is wholly sound at the moment. And we're also a country that is addicted to fossil fuels, addicted to the stuff that actually powers Russia, that powers their economy, their last line of defense. The EU has announced that they put together a task force with the goal of reducing their dependence on Russian oil. The U.S. has said that it will work with other nations to increase natural gas exports to Europe so they can be less dependent. The goal is to reduce the demand for natural gas long term. That would help to, you know, take Russia's foot off of Europe's neck. About 40% of EU gas, 25+% of their oil comes from Russia. Does it strike you as a missed opportunity that the West, that the United States, that Europe are not trying to find a way to not only get us, out of hock, or get Europe out of hock to countries like Russia, but also out of hock to OPEC, out of hock to all of these oil dynasties around the world, none of whom seem to be the best actors? Is it a missed opportunity that we're not saying maybe the answer here is that we start to push back from our addiction to fossil fuels overall?
Well, I hope it will not be a missed opportunity, because, as you point out, I think this is really a wake-up call, certainly for the Europeans, about over the past decade or more, that they have increased their reliance on Russian energy supplies. And it's very clear, certainly under Putin, that the Russian bear is a menace, but that dependence is a strategic vulnerability. And so they need to be able to divorce themselves from that type of energy lifeline. But your point about OPEC and fossil fuels, I think, is a very good one. Climate change, all of these factors. It's difficult for a lot of these countries, economies, systems to turn rapidly, but you have to start somewhere. And I do think that what has happened now in Ukraine really needs to be taken into account by countries globally in terms of what we need to do in order to protect ourselves from the menace of these autocrats, but also to move away from the fossil fuel reliance that has really been, I think, the hallmark of global activity for the past many, many decades.